Before Disney softened it, Cinderella was a blood-soaked warning told to children, a glittering ball, a lost slipper, a prince who searches the kingdom, and a happily ever after. But the oldest versions of Cinderella do not end with a wedding. They end with a mutilated foot buried beneath a hazel tree that, according to legend, still grows human bones. Tonight, for the next 80 minutes, you will discover why every single culture on Earth has its own Cinderella story, and why almost all of them are soaked in blood. You will learn about the Egyptian courtesan whose shoe was stolen by an eagle, the Chinese girl whose magical fish was murdered and eaten by her stepmother, the Italian child who slammed a trunk lid on her stepmother's neck, only to gain an even crueler one, the medieval laws that controlled daughters through violence, the folk traditions that warned of children buried beneath hazel trees, and the 20th century legends of girls who left shoes outside on New Year's Eve and vanished. Some details will disturb you. Some will make you question every children's book on your shelf. And one detail, the very last one, is a legend nobody talks about. Stay until the end, because that is the darkest story of all. Let us begin with the version you probably grew up with. 1950, Walt Disney's Cinderella. A kind girl in rags. Two ugly stepsisters. A pumpkin carriage. A fairy godmother with a magic wand. And a glass slipper that fits only one foot in the entire kingdom. The stepsisters are clumsy and jealous, but nobody gets seriously hurt. The mice help sew the dress. Cinderella forgives everyone. Everyone lives happily ever after. It feels safe. Magical. Disney's film became the second highest grossing movie of 1950. It saved the studio from bankruptcy. It defined the Disney princess brand for 70 years. But Disney didn't invent this story. He adapted it. And every adaptation before his was darker. Now travel back 53 years earlier to 1697, Paris. Charles Perrault, a French poet and member of the Académie Française, publishes Histoires ou contes du temps passé, stories or tales of past times. Inside is a story called Cinderella ou la petite pantoufle de verre, Cinderella or the little glass slipper. This is the first time the glass slipper appears in print. Perrault adds a fairy godmother. He adds the pumpkin carriage. He adds the midnight deadline. But he also adds something Disney quietly removed. When the stepsisters try to force their feet into the slipper, the fairy godmother does nothing. Instead, doves fly down from the sky and peck out both of their eyes. One eye each at the ball. The second eye each at the wedding. Perrault ends the story by saying the sisters lived the rest of their lives as blind beggars on the streets of Paris. He closes with a moral for children. Beauty is a rare treasure, but a good heart is worth more. The intended audience? Children aged 6 to 12. Fast forward another century and 15 years, to 1812 Germany. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm publish the first edition of Kinder- und Hausmärchen, Children's and Household Tales. Their Cinderella, called Aschenputtel, is even crueler. There is no fairy godmother. Instead, Cinderella plants a hazel twig on her mother's grave and waters it with her tears until it grows into a tree. When she needs help, she kneels beneath the tree and weeps, and a white bird throws down whatever she wishes, gowns of gold and silver, slippers stitched with silk. At the ball, the prince falls in love. Cinderella runs. He chases her through the forest, but she climbs into a pigeon coop and hides. The prince chops down the pigeon coop with an axe. She escapes again, this time climbing a pear tree. He chops down the pear tree. Finally, he spreads pitch, sticky black tar, across the palace steps so she cannot escape a third time. Her slipper sticks. She leaves it behind and runs barefoot into the night, her feet bleeding. The next morning, the prince arrives at her home with the golden slipper. The stepmother takes her eldest daughter into a back room, hands her a knife, and says, "Cut off your toe. When you are queen, you will never have to walk again." The eldest daughter slices off her big toe. Blood fills the slipper. She forces her foot inside anyway. The prince rides away with her, until two doves perched on the hazel tree cry out, "Look back! Back! There's blood in the shoe. The true bride waits for you." The The prince turns his horse around, sees the blood pouring from the slipper, and returns the eldest daughter to her mother. The stepmother then takes the second daughter into the back room and says, "Cut off your heel." The second daughter slices off her heel. Again blood. Again the doves. At the wedding, the two stepsisters walk beside Cinderella as bridesmaids. The doves swoop down and peck out the right eye of the first sister and the left eye of the second. After the ceremony, they walk on the other side. The doves return and peck out the remaining eyes. The Grimm brothers wrote, "Thus they were punished with blindness for the rest of their days." This version was published in 7 editions between 1812 and 1857, each time softening the violence slightly, but never removing it entirely. By the 20th century, the Grimm version had been translated into more than 160 languages and sold over 200 million copies. This is still the story we tell children. Only now, the violence has been sanded down, hidden behind smiling mice and sparkling animation. But the blood was always there. And it gets older. Much, much older. Let us go back 2,000 years. The oldest surviving Cinderella story comes from Egypt and Greece, 1st century BC. The Greek geographer and historian Strabo, writing around 7 BC in his 17-volume work Geographica, records the tale of a woman named Rhodopis. Rhodopis, whose name means rosy-cheeked, is a Greek courtesan living in Egypt during the 26th dynasty of the pharaohs. Some versions say she was born free. Others say she was enslaved as a child and brought to Egypt by Thracian traders. One day, while bathing in the Nile River, Rhodopis removes her rose-red sandals and places them on the riverbank. An eagle, some say the god Horus in disguise, swoops down, steals one of the sandals, and flies south toward Memphis, the capital city. The pharaoh Ahmose II is sitting in his outdoor court, dispensing justice, when the eagle drops the tiny sandal into his lap. The pharaoh is enchanted. He examines the sandal. It is exquisitely made, no larger than a child's hand, rose-red leather stitched with gold thread. He believes this is a sign from the gods. He orders every woman in Egypt to be brought before him so he can find the owner of the sandal. When Rhodopis is finally discovered, the pharaoh marries her, and she becomes queen. No fairy godmother. No ball. No magic. Just a stolen shoe and a king obsessed with a woman's foot. But there is something darker hidden in this story. In ancient Egypt, foot size was an indicator of social class. Peasants and slaves walked barefoot or wore rough papyrus sandals, which caused their feet to spread and harden. Noble women wore delicate leather sandals from childhood, which kept their feet small and soft, a sign of wealth, because it meant they never had to work. A tiny foot meant you were too precious to touch the ground. So when the pharaoh searches the kingdom for a foot small enough to fit the sandal, he is not searching for love. He is searching for status. He is searching for a woman whose body has been shaped, perhaps restricted, since childhood to fit an ideal. This is the first recorded story in human history about a shoe that determines a woman's worth. Now travel forward 1,300 years, to China, around the year 860 CE. A writer named Duan Chengshi records a story in his collection Yuyang Zizu, Miscellaneous Morsels from Yuyang. The story is called Yi Xian, Yeshan. Yi Xian is the daughter of a cave chief in southern China. Her mother dies when she is young. Her father remarries and then dies soon after, leaving Yi Xian in the care of her stepmother and stepsister. The stepmother forces Yi Xian to collect firewood barefoot in the mountains, draw water from dangerous wells, and sleep in the ashes by the kitchen hearth. Yi Xian's only friend is a fish. Not an ordinary fish. This fish is over 10 feet long, with scales that shimmer gold and red, and eyes like lanterns. Every day, Yi Xian goes to the pond and feeds the fish scraps of rice. The fish rises to the surface and rests its head in her hands. The stepmother notices. One day, she disguises herself in Yi Xian's clothing, goes to the pond, and calls to the fish. The fish rises, trusting. The stepmother kills it with a knife, drags it back to the house, cooks it, and serves it to the family for dinner. Yi Xian returns to the pond and finds it empty. She collapses by the water and weeps. Suddenly, an old man with wild hair descends from the sky. Some versions say he is an immortal. Others say he is the spirit of her dead father. He tells Yi Xian, "The fish is dead, but its bones hold magic. Dig them from the trash heap. Hide them in your room. Whatever you wish for, the bones will grant." Yi Xian retrieves the bones, still slick with grease and blood, and hides them beneath her sleeping mat. From that day forward, whenever she is hungry, she asks the bones for food, and a feast appears. When she is cold, she asks for warmth, and fire springs from the floor. One evening, the stepmother and stepsister leave for the spring festival, a grand celebration where young women go to be seen by wealthy families and potential husbands. Yi Xian is forbidden to attend, but as soon as they are gone, she kneels before the fish bones and whispers, "I wish to go to the festival." The bones give her a gown made of kingfisher feathers, azure and emerald, shimmering like water, a cloak of translucent silk, and a pair of golden shoes, so small and delicate they make no sound when she walks. Some scholars believe this is one of the earliest literary references to the cultural ideal of small feet in China, which would later evolve into the practice of foot binding. The festival is held in a series of caves lit by thousands of lanterns. Yi Xian enters and every head turns. But then, across the crowd, she sees her stepsister. Terrified of being recognized, Yi Xian runs. In her haste, she loses one golden shoe. A merchant finds it the next morning. He sells it to the king of a neighboring region, a man named Han. The king is mesmerized by the shoe. He orders every woman in his kingdom to try it on. Not one foot fits. The shoe is no longer than a finger. The king begins to suspect magic. He places the shoe in his pavilion by the roadside, hoping the true owner will come to claim it. One night, Yi Xian creeps to the pavilion and retrieves the shoe. The king's guards catch her. She is dragged before the king, barefoot, dressed in rags. But when she puts on both golden shoes, her rags transform back into the gown of kingfisher feathers. The king marries her. And the fish bones? Yi Xian brings them to the palace. But the king becomes greedy. He asks the bones for too much: gold, jade, immortality. The bones stop answering. 1 year later, the tide rises and swallows the bones, dragging them into the sea, where they are never seen again. As for the stepmother and stepsister, they return home one evening to find their house surrounded by stones. The stones begin to fly. The two women are crushed to death, buried beneath a rockslide. This story, Yi Xian, is the first to include a murdered magical helper talking bones, shoes made of gold, a foot so small it defies natural proportion, death by supernatural punishment. It predates Perrault by 837 years. It predates the Grimm brothers by 952 years. Now travel forward another 774 years, to 1634, in the Kingdom of Naples. A soldier, poet, and courtier named Giambattista de Basile publishes a collection of 50 fairy tales called Lo Conto dei Conti, the Tale of Tales. It is written entirely in Neapolitan dialect, and it is one of the most violent fairy tale collections ever printed. Inside is a story called La Gatta Cenerentola, the cat Cinderella. This is the version no one talks about. The protagonist is named Zazala. She lives with her father, a widowed prince, and a cruel stepmother who beats her, starves her, and forces her to sleep with the cats in the chimney corner. Zazala has a governess, a kind woman who secretly teaches her to read and gives her scraps of food. One day, the governess whispers, "If you want to be free, you must act." "How?" asks Zazala. The governess says, "Your father has an old storage trunk in the corridor. Tomorrow, when your stepmother bends inside to get the winter linens, slam the lid on her neck and lean with all your weight. Do not let go until she stops moving. Tell your father it was an accident." Zazala obeys. The next day, when the stepmother bends into the trunk, Zazala slams the lid down on her neck. The stepmother thrashes. Her fingers claw at the wood. Her screams are muffled by the fabric inside. Zazala leans harder. The stepmother's neck snaps. Zazala tells her father it was an accident. The lid was heavy, her hands slipped. The father believes her. He buries his wife without question. Weeks later, the governess says to Zazala, "You are free now. But you must ensure I am cared for in my old age. Tell your father to marry me." Zazala, grateful, convinces her father. The governess becomes the new wife. And on the wedding night, she reveals 6 daughters of her own, 6 cruel, vain daughters who immediately begin tormenting Zazala. The new stepmother is far worse than the first. She forces Zazala to work day and night. She renames her gata Cenerentola, cat Cinderella, because she sleeps curled in the ashes like a stray cat. Zazala weeps at her mother's grave. And from the grave, a date tree begins to grow, fast, unnaturally fast, watered by her tears. The tree is magical. Whenever Zazala asks, it drops down gowns of silk and velvet, jeweled combs, and shoes called pianelle, platform shoes with heels carved from wood and inlaid with mother of pearl. One day, the king announces a 3-day feast. All the maidens of the land are invited. The stepsisters go, draped in borrowed finery, faces painted white with lead powder. Zazala stays behind, until the date tree gives her a gown the color of the sea, and shoes so beautiful they seem to glow. At the feast, the prince cannot look away from her. But at midnight, Zazala flees, losing one shoe on the palace steps. The prince is obsessed. He orders every woman in the kingdom to try the shoe. When the stepsisters attempt to fit their feet inside, Basile writes, they squeezed and twisted and crushed their toes until blood spurted from beneath their nails and filled the shoe like a cup of wine. Finally, Zazala is found. She marries the prince. And at the wedding feast, Basile hints, subtly but clearly, that the stepmother and stepsisters are served at the banquet. Not as guests. As the main course. The final line of the story reads, and those who had made her life a meal of ashes became, in the end, a meal themselves. This is the darkest European version of Cinderella ever published. It includes premeditated murder, betrayal, cannibalism, and brutal mutilation, all presented as a tale for children and families. Basile's collection was wildly popular in Italy and influenced the Grimm brothers 2 centuries later. But why is this story, this specific pattern, so universal? Why does every culture on Earth have some version of a girl in ashes, a lost shoe, and a search that ends in blood? The answer lies not just in fairy tales. It lies in the harsh realities of history that shaped these stories. The violence in Cinderella is not random. It reflects real anxieties, real power structures, and real dangers that people faced for centuries. Let us begin with the control of daughters. In medieval Europe, daughters were considered property. Under various legal codes across the Holy Roman Empire, fathers had extraordinary power over their daughters' lives and bodies. Historical records show that daughters who disobeyed, who ran away, who married without permission, who refused arranged marriages, faced severe punishments. While specific punishments varied by region and time period, legal historians have documented cases of forced confinement in convents, public whipping and branding, disinheritance and exile in extreme cases, physical mutilation. The threat of being unable to run, unable to escape, unable to walk away from an abusive home. This was a real fear that permeated medieval society. The image of a severed foot in Cinderella is not just symbolic. It represents the very real ways daughters' autonomy and mobility were controlled. Now let us talk about the hazel tree. Between 1315 and 1317, Europe was struck by the Great Famine. Crops failed across the continent. Grain stores rotted, livestock died. Summers were cold and wet, winters were endless. Historical estimates suggest that 10 to 25% of the population of Northern Europe died from starvation. Medieval chronicles record heartbreaking accounts of families unable to feed their children. Some children were abandoned in forests, left at monastery doors, or simply left behind when families fled in search of food. Some were sold to passing merchants or given to wealthier families as servants. And some, according to folklore and scattered historical accounts, did not survive. Folk traditions across Germany, France, and Poland speak of unmarked graves in forests, particularly beneath fast-growing trees like hazel. Hazel was significant in European folk belief. It was considered a tree of wisdom, protection, and the boundary between the living and the dead. In some folk traditions, planting a hazel tree was believed to mark a place of sorrow, a memorial that would grow and hide what lay beneath. In Grimm's Aschenputtel, Cinderella plants a hazel twig on her mother's grave. She waters it with her tears. It grows into a tree that grants her wishes. This may reflect the folk memory of children who died young, remembered through the trees that marked their resting places, trees that, in stories, continued to protect and provide for the living. Now let us talk about the glass slipper. In Charles Perrault's 1697 version, Cinderella's slipper is made of verre, glass. But in earlier oral versions, it was likely verre, fur, specifically squirrel or ermine. Many scholars believe Perrault, or a later printer, mistranslated or misheard the word, and fur slipper became glass slipper. The mistake stuck. But why does glass make the story more resonant? Because glass is fragile. Glass is impossible to walk in comfortably. Glass can cut. A glass slipper is not a practical shoe. It is a symbol of beauty that is painful, of perfection that is impossible, of an ideal that damages those who pursue it. And it mirrors a real practice that devastated millions of women: foot binding. The practice of foot binding in China began during the Tang dynasty, around the 10th century CE, not long after the story of Yi Xian was first recorded. It spread during the Song dynasty and became widespread among upper and middle-class families by the 13th century. The process was brutal. Girls as young as 4 to 6 years old had their feet tightly bound with cloth bandages. The 4 smallest toes were bent backward and pressed under the sole of the foot. The bandages were wrapped tighter and tighter over months and years, breaking bones and preventing natural growth. The ideal result, called a lotus foot, or golden lotus, was a foot no more than 3 to 4 inches long. Women with bound feet walked with a distinctive swaying gait, taking tiny steps. This was considered beautiful, refined, and marriageable. An unbound woman was often considered unmarriageable and a burden to her family. It's estimated that hundreds of millions of Chinese women had their feet bound between the 10th century and the early 20th century, when the practice was finally outlawed in 1912. The practice caused chronic pain, disability, infections, and in some cases, death from complications. Medical historians have documented the severe physical consequences: permanently broken and deformed bones, chronic infections, difficulty walking, lifelong pain, and it all started with a cultural ideal of a tiny, beautiful foot, an ideal reflected in the golden shoes of Yi Xian. A glass slipper that only one foot in the kingdom can fit is the perfect Western metaphor for this kind of impossible, painful beauty standard. Finally, let us talk about the cinders. In medieval and early modern Europe, domestic servants, particularly young girls, occupied the lowest rung of the household hierarchy. They slept in the coldest, darkest parts of the house, near the hearth, in the kitchen, in attics or cellars. The hearth was the warmest place in winter, but it was also the dirtiest, full of ash, smoke, and soot. Servants who tended the fire would be covered in cinders and ash by morning. Historical accounts describe how these servants were often treated, given the hardest, dirtiest work, fed less than other members of the household, dressed in rags or hand-me-downs, beaten for minor infractions, rarely allowed to leave the house. A girl sleeping in the ashes, covered in soot, unrecognizable. This was not a fantasy. It was a reality for countless poor girls across Europe for centuries. The Cinderella figure represents every servant girl who was invisible, forgotten, and abused. And the fantasy of the story, that one of these girls might be recognized, elevated, and saved, was just that, a fantasy. A dangerous one, perhaps, that encouraged endurance rather than resistance. But also a story of hope in hopeless circumstances. This is the soil from which Cinderella grew. Not pure imagination, but stories shaped by real suffering, real power imbalances, and real survival strategies. These were not just stories. They were warnings. Maps for navigating a dangerous world. So why does this story endure? Why do we keep telling it, in every language, in every century, in every culture on Earth? Because Cinderella is not one story. It is the architecture of trauma and transformation. In 1976, child psychologist Bruno Bettelheim published The Uses of Enchantment, a groundbreaking study of fairy tales and their psychological functions. He called Cinderella the perfect story of maternal anxiety. Here is what he meant. When a child's mother dies and the father remarries, the child experiences a rupture in identity. The new mother is not the mother. She looks like a mother. She occupies the mother's space. But she is a stranger. The child's unconscious mind may interpret this as danger, because in evolutionary terms, a stepparent has less biological incentive to protect a child that is not hers. In fact, in many species, stepmothers prioritize their own offspring over stepchildren. Bettelheim argued that Cinderella externalizes this fear. The stepmother is not cruel because she is evil by nature. She is cruel because she is not the real mother. She is the mother's shadow. The anti-mother. The mother who starves instead of feeds, who punishes instead of protects. And the stepsisters? They represent the siblings the child fears will replace her in her father's love. Cinderella's exile to the hearth is symbolic death. She is removed from the family, unrecognized, unmourned. But she is resurrected by the mother's memory, manifested as the hazel tree or the fairy godmother or the talking bones. The real mother never truly abandons her daughter. Even in death, she provides. Now let us turn to Carl Jung. Jung saw Cinderella as a story of individuation, the process by which a person integrates their unconscious self, the shadow, with their conscious identity, the persona. The ashes represent the shadow, the parts of ourselves we are ashamed of, the parts we hide, the parts society rejects. Cinderella is forced to live in her shadow. She is denied beauty, status, recognition. But the shadow is also the place of transformation. In alchemical texts, which Jung studied extensively, ashes are called prima materia, the first matter. To create gold, you must begin with base matter. With dirt. With ash. Cinderella does not escape the ashes by denying them. She transforms because of them. The glass slipper, in Jungian terms, is the self, the integrated, authentic identity that fits only one person. The prince's search is not really a search for a bride. It is a search for authenticity, for the one person who has not cut away pieces of herself to fit someone else's expectations. The stepsisters mutilate their feet because they are trying to force themselves into an identity that does not fit. They are pretending. Cinderella does not pretend. She is whole, even in her suffering. But there is another layer, a sociological one. Cinderella is also a story about class and social mobility. In every version of the tale, Cinderella's transformation is temporary. The magic lasts only until midnight. The gown turns back to rags. The carriage turns back to a pumpkin. She returns to the ashes. This reflects the reality of social mobility in feudal and early modern Europe. It was rare, fragile, and often illusory. You can dress a peasant in silk, but when the clock strikes midnight, the silk disappears, and she is a peasant again. The only way to escape poverty permanently is to marry into wealth, and even that requires extraordinary luck, beauty, or in the fairy tales logic, magic. The stepsister's mutilation can be read as a metaphor for what poor families had to do to survive. Cut away pieces of themselves. Endure pain. Pretend to be something they are not. Sacrifice their bodies for a chance at a better life. And when they fail, they are punished with blindness, a symbolic erasure. They are cast out, forgotten, left to beg. Because in a feudal economy, failure is not just personal failure. It is social annihilation. Finally, let us talk about modern psychology. In 1981, psychotherapist Colette Dowling published a book called The Cinderella Complex: Women's Hidden Fear of Independence. She argued that many women are socialized from childhood to wait for rescue, to believe that they cannot save themselves, that they need external validation, that they need someone else to recognize their worth. This is related to a psychological concept called learned helplessness. Cinderella does not try to escape. She endures. She waits. And when rescue comes, it is external: a fairy godmother, a prince, a magical tree. Dowling's book sparked fierce debate. Some praised it as an important feminist observation. Others condemned it as oversimplified or victim-blaming. But the term entered popular psychology. And in the decades since, researchers have identified patterns in family dynamics and child welfare that echo the Cinderella story. In evolutionary psychology, the Cinderella effect refers to research showing that children living with stepparents are statistically at higher risk for abuse and neglect than children living with both biological parents. This does not mean all stepparents are abusive, the vast majority are not. But it reflects a statistical pattern that researchers have documented across cultures. Studies suggest that the absence of biological connection can, in some cases, reduce the instinctive protective response that parents feel toward their genetic offspring. The fairy tale, in this light, is not just a story. It is an encoded warning that has been passed down for thousands of years. Blended families can be dangerous. Be wary. Protect yourself. Survive. Let us now travel the world. Because Cinderella is not European. It is not Chinese. It is not Egyptian. It is human. Folklorists have documented over 1,000 variants of the Cinderella story across the globe. Let me take you through some of the most haunting. Scotland, Ration Cody. In the Scottish Highlands, there is a folk tale called Ration Cody, Rushy Coat. The girl's name is never given. Her mother dies and her father remarries. The stepmother forces her to herd cattle barefoot in the freezing moors. The girl's only friend is a red calf. Every day, the calf gives her food from its ear, bread, milk, honey. The stepmother discovers this and orders the calf to be slaughtered. The girl weeps over the calf's body. According to the story, the calf's bones begin to speak. Take my hooves and tail. Bury them beneath the hearthstone. When you need me, knock 3 times. The girl obeys. Later, when she wishes to attend the church festival, she knocks 3 times on the hearthstone. In the tale, the calf's ghost rises through the floor, described as half-rotted, covered in grave dirt, and gives her a gown of rushes woven with gold thread. At the festival, the laird's son falls in love with her. She flees, losing 1 shoe. But in this version, when the stepsisters try to fit their feet into the shoe, a wren perched on the windowsill begins to sing, "Nip it, clip it, hack it, itchew it, blood and bone will see you through it." The stepsisters cut off their toes and heels. The shoe fills with blood. The wren cries. The true foot waits beneath the stone, where the red calf's hooves have grown. The laird's son digs up the hearthstone and finds the girl. He marries her. And the stepmother? According to the folk tale, she is sewn into a sack filled with adders, venomous snakes, and rolled down a hill into the loch, where she drowns. Algeria and Morocco, folklore of the pomegranate girl. In Algerian and Moroccan folklore, there are versions where the heroine is known only as the daughter of the pomegranate. In these oral traditions, her mother dies and her father remarries a woman with 3 daughters. According to the tales, the stepmother treats the girl cruelly, burning her hands and feet so she cannot run away. The girl's only comfort is a pomegranate tree her mother planted before she died. In the story, when the girl weeps beneath the tree, her tears crack open a pomegranate, and inside is a tiny bird. The bird offers her magical gifts, beauty, the ability to fly, or invisibility, depending on which part of the bird she consumes. Different versions of the tale include various fates for the stepmother and stepsisters, often involving supernatural punishment. Some versions end with the girl being unable to speak after discovering a terrible truth at her wedding feast, a cautionary element about the price of transformation. Pacific Northwest Indigenous traditions. The fire-marked girl. Among some Pacific Northwest indigenous peoples, oral traditions include stories about a girl whose face is scarred by fire. In these stories, her sisters are jealous of her kindness and push her into the cooking fire when she is a child. Her face is burned. She is shunned by the village. According to the traditional story, the spirit of her dead mother appears as a raven and leads her to a frozen lake. When she steps onto the ice, it forms into shoes made of ice so cold they burn. She walks to the chief's longhouse, and the ice shoes create a glittering path behind her. When she arrives, the chief sees not her scars but something else, the light, the spirit, the truth beneath. She dances, and the ice shoes make haunting sounds. At dawn she runs, and 1 shoe melts. The chief searches for the woman whose foot fits the remaining ice shoe. When her cruel sisters try to wear it, the ice burns them, blistering their feet with frostbite. When the scarred girl places her foot in the shoe, it melts completely, and in some versions, the water washes away her scars, revealing her true face. But in other, darker versions of this oral tradition, the girl is revealed to be a spirit. She died in the fire years ago, and the raven brought her back for one night only. The wedding takes place at dawn, but as the sun rises, she turns to ice and shatters, leaving the chief holding only a frozen footprint. Philippines, Maria and the Golden Carabao. In Filipino folklore, particularly in Tagalog and Visayan regions, there is a story often called Si Maria at ang Gintong Calabao, Maria and the Golden Carabao. Maria's mother dies, and her father remarries a woman who forces Maria to work in the rice paddies from dawn until nightfall. Maria's only friend is an old carabao, water buffalo, with golden horns. The carabao is magical. It can speak, and it helps Maria plow the fields in half the time. According to the tale, the stepmother grows suspicious and poisons the carabao's water. Maria finds the carabao dead and buries it beneath a mango tree, weeping for 3 days. On the third day, the story says, the mango tree blooms out of season, covered in golden flowers that smell like death. The tree speaks, telling Maria to dig up the golden horns, which will grant her 3 wishes. She wishes for a beautiful dress, golden sandals, and the chance to attend the town fiesta. At the fiesta, the mayor's son falls in love with her. She flees at midnight, losing one sandal in the mud. The mayor's son searches the province for the sandal's owner. When the stepsisters try the sandal, they cut off their toes, but it still doesn't fit. Finally, Maria is found. In the folk tale's climax, she uses her third and final wish to ask the golden horns to punish those who killed the carabao. The horns glow, and according to the story, the stepmother and stepsisters are dragged underground by invisible hands, pulled down into the roots of the mango tree. Village legends say their screams could be heard for 7 days. Years later, when the tree is cut down, storytellers claim that 3 skeletons were found wrapped in the roots, fused with the wood, mouths open as if screaming. Basque Country, the girl in the chestnut shell. In the Basque regions of Spain and France, there is a traditional story sometimes called the girl in the chestnut shell. The girl's mother dies in autumn, and her father marries the village healer, a woman who knows old magic from before Christianity. The healer has 2 daughters of her own and despises the girl because she looks too much like the dead wife. According to the folk tale, one night the healer gives the girl a tea made from nightshade, telling her it will help her sleep. The girl drinks it and falls into a death-like coma. The healer tells the father the girl has died. She is buried in the chestnut grove. But the girl is not dead, she is trapped inside her body, aware but unable to move. 3 days later, she wakes in the darkness and claws her way out of the grave. She stumbles to the village covered in dirt and blood, wearing only a burial shroud. No one recognizes her. Her face is pale, her eyes are dark, and she smells of earth. The villagers believe she is a Sorjanak, a witch risen from the dead. They chase her back into the forest. She hides inside the hollow of a giant chestnut tree. And there, according to the legend, she finds the bones of other girls, many bones, stacked inside the tree. The girl realizes she is not the first stepdaughter the healer has killed. On the night of the autumn festival, the healer's 2 daughters dress in stolen finery and go to dance. But the girl emerges from the chestnut tree, wearing a dress made of bark and moss, and shoes carved from chestnut shells. When she dances, the shells make a clicking sound like bones. The mayor's son is entranced and follows her into the forest. She shows him the chestnut tree and the bones inside. He returns to the village and accuses the healer. In the folk tale, the healer is tried and executed. Her daughters are exiled. But the girl? She never leaves the forest. Some versions of the legend say she still lives inside the chestnut tree, waiting for other lost girls to find her. Other versions say she became a tree herself, and that if you press your ear to the trunk on autumn nights, you can hear her whispering the names of the dead. These are not just fairy tales. They are cultural memories, survival strategies, and warnings encoded in story form. And they all carry the same essential message: the mother is dead. The new mother may be dangerous. Trust your instincts. Run if you can. Fight if you must. And remember, rescue is not guaranteed. Let us return to the present. The story of Cinderella did not end in 1950 with Disney. It continues today, both in psychology and in troubling real-world patterns. In the 1980s and 1990s, forensic psychologists and social workers began documenting patterns in child abuse cases that eerily mirrored the Cinderella narrative. They called it Cinderella syndrome, not a metaphor, but a clinical term. Cinderella syndrome describes a specific form of child abuse where a stepparent isolates, neglects, and physically harms a stepchild while simultaneously providing care and affection to their biological children. The pattern includes the child being forced to do excessive household labor, the child being deprived of food while other children in the home are fed, the child being dressed inadequately or in rags, the child being locked away from social contact, the child being denied medical care or education, the child being told repeatedly that they are worthless, unwanted, or dirty. This is not folklore. This is documented in child welfare records and family court cases. Multiple high-profile child abuse cases in the late 20th and early 21st centuries have been described by prosecutors and media as Cinderella cases, where the victim's treatment so closely mirrored the fairy tale that the parallel became impossible to ignore. In evolutionary psychology, researchers identified what they called the Cinderella effect. Studies across multiple cultures have shown that children living with one or more stepparent are statistically at higher risk for abuse and neglect than children living with both biological parents. This does not mean stepparents are inherently dangerous. The vast majority of blended families are loving and healthy. But the statistical pattern exists and has been documented by researchers including Martin Daly and Margot Wilson in their work on family violence. The theory suggests that the absence of genetic relatedness can, in some cases, reduce the instinctive protective response parents feel toward their biological offspring. From an evolutionary perspective, investing resources in stepchildren does not increase one's own genetic fitness, which may explain why, statistically, stepchildren face higher risks. The fairy tale, in this light, is not just entertainment. It is a warning that has been encoded in human culture for thousands of years. Blended families can carry risks. Be vigilant. Protect the vulnerable. Survive. But there is another modern echo, one that reveals how the Cinderella obsession with feet has never truly gone away. In the early 2000s, a cosmetic surgery procedure became popular among wealthy women in major cities like New York, Los Angeles, London, and Seoul. It was marketed as Cinderella surgery. The procedure involved surgical shortening of the toes, narrowing the width of the foot, injecting fillers into the ball of the foot, shaving down bunions, breaking and resetting bones to create a higher arch. The stated goal? To fit into designer high heels, particularly narrow luxury brands like Christian Louboutin stilettos. Women reportedly paid between $5,000 and $40,000 for these elective procedures. Recovery took months. Many developed chronic pain. Some experienced permanent difficulty walking. In 2012, the American Podiatric Medical Association publicly condemned the practice, calling it medically unnecessary and potentially harmful. But clinics still offer variations of the procedure. In South Korea, it is sometimes called glass slipper surgery. In China, some clinics market it as lotus foot revival. The language changes. The desire to physically alter one's body to fit an impossible standard of beauty that remains. The violence of the stepsisters cutting off their toes to fit the slipper? That is not ancient history. That is happening today in medical clinics by choice for fashion. And then, there are the legends. The legends that never stopped. In parts of rural Bavaria, Bohemia, and the Austrian Alps, there was, according to oral tradition and folklore collections, a New Year's Eve custom practiced by unmarried young women. The tradition, as recorded by folklorists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, went like this. At midnight on New Year's Eve, an unmarried girl would go to the front door of her house. She would remove her right shoe. She would place it on the doorstep, toe pointing outward, toward the road. She would go back inside without looking back. She was not to look outside until morning. On New Year's morning, according to the tradition, if she found blood inside the shoe, it meant she would marry within the year. If the shoe was gone entirely, it meant death before spring. If the shoe was untouched and clean, it meant she would remain unmarried another year. This tradition was documented by ethnographers and folklorists in the 1890s and early 1900s as a quaint rural superstition. But according to local legends and oral histories collected in the region, something darker was attached to this custom. Village elders told stories of girls who disappeared around New Year's, girls who left shoes outside and were never seen again. In some versions of the legend, their shoes were later found in wells, in rivers, or buried in the forest. And in the most disturbing versions of these folk tales, the shoes were said to contain evidence of violence, blood, fabric, and in some stories, severed toes. Whether these disappearances actually happened, or whether they were cautionary tales told to keep young women from wandering alone at night, is unclear. What is documented is that the tradition existed, and that it was surrounded by warnings and dark folklore. The tradition reportedly faded after World War I, though some isolated families continued variations of it into the mid-20th century. In the 1980s, a German journalist interviewed elderly women in rural Bavaria about old traditions. One woman, then in her 80s, reportedly said, "We were told never to look outside. If you looked, you would see who took the shoe. And if you saw you could never marry, you would be marked. My sister looked 1 year. She disappeared 3 days later. They said her shoe was found in the river, but there was no body. We never spoke of it again." Whether this account represents actual events, confused memory, or embellished folklore passed down through generations is impossible to verify. But the legend persists in the region. In 2003, according to regional newspaper reports, archaeological excavations near a medieval church foundation in what is now the Czech Republic uncovered a stone-lined pit. Inside, archaeologists reportedly found a collection of old shoes, some dating back several centuries. Local historians suggested these might have been votive offerings or items buried according to folk customs. Some of the shoes reportedly contained organic material, though detailed analysis results were not widely published. The site was documented and then reburied as part of standard archaeological practice. Whether this finding has any connection to the New Year's shoe legends, or whether it represents an entirely separate folk practice, remains a matter of speculation. What we do know is this: folk traditions involving shoes, particularly women's shoes, appear across many cultures. Shoes buried in walls for good luck. Shoes thrown at weddings for fertility. Shoes left at crossroads as offerings. Shoes hidden in chimneys to ward off evil spirits. The shoe, in folklore, is a powerful symbol. It represents journey, transformation, identity, and sometimes sacrifice. The hazel tree appears in legends across Europe. The shoe appears in rituals across the world. And the story of Cinderella, of a girl who survives by remembering her mother, who transforms through suffering, who is recognized by a single, perfect fit, continues to be told. Because the story is not about glass slippers or fairy godmothers. It is about survival. About being seen when the world tries to make you invisible. About refusing to cut away pieces of yourself to fit someone else's expectations. And about the terrifying truth that not every Cinderella gets rescued. Some are still waiting. Some are still running. And some were buried beneath the trees a long time ago. The story of Cinderella is not about a girl who gets rescued. It is about a girl who survives. She survives the death of her mother. She survives the cruelty of her stepmother. She survives starvation, isolation, and erasure. She survives because she remembers her mother's love, hidden in bones, in trees, in birds, in magic that rises from grief. And when the world finally sees her, it is not because a prince chose her. It is because she was the only one willing to show her true self, the only one who didn't cut away pieces of herself to fit someone else's story. The stepsisters failed because they tried to force themselves into an identity that wasn't theirs. Cinderella succeeded because she stayed whole. But the price of that wholeness is written in blood across every version of this tale. Blood in the shoe. Bones beneath the tree. Blindness, fire, stones, and graves. The fairy tale is not a fantasy of rescue. It is a memorial. For every girl who was told she was worthless. For every child buried and forgotten. For every daughter whose foot was bound, whose voice was stolen, whose name was erased. For every servant who slept in the ashes and was never seen. The story remembers them. And so should we. Thank you for staying until the end. If this exploration of dark folklore and cultural history resonated with you, please subscribe and ring the bell. Next week, we're covering the fairy tale that inspired witch hunts and got thousands killed. It began on Christmas night during the Wild Hunt, when men wore wolf skins and danced under the winter moon, and the church called them demons. We'll trace it from the Black Forest to the witch trials of the 1600s, through the Inquisition records and folk traditions that still survive today. We'll discover why some villages still refuse to say its name out loud. And we'll explore the legend of the werewolf of Bedburg, and what was really happening in those German forests in 1589. Until then, keep your shoes inside.